I sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee, the steam rising lazily in the morning air. My mother's voice, soft and measured, broke the silence. "We're going to visit Uncle John for a few days. He's expecting us in that new city." I didn't look up at her, my fingers still twirling the spoon, not wanting to acknowledge her words. Something in her tone, though, made me pause. It was too calm, almost as if she were trying to hide something. But what could it be? Dad was sitting in the corner, his face illuminated by the light from his phone, his thumbs scrolling with a kind of quiet determination. He didn't lift his gaze. It hit me like a wave, sudden and heavy, the irritation, the frustration. I didn't want to go. I had just gotten into a rhythm, a routine. Tom, my boyfriend, had just left for his business trip, and this sudden plan, felt like an interruption. I hadn't even asked for it, but my mom was already packing things, making decisions like it was normal. I glanced over at her, a silent protest swelling in my chest. I didn't understand why I felt so upset. It was just a visit to an uncle I barely knew. Uncle John. I had met him only a few times, and those encounters had been brief, superficial. Why was I so resistant? Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was that nagging feeling of being left behind while everything else seemed to be moving forward. Why did I have to be the one to get on that plane? It all felt wrong. But I knew better than to argue. It was pointless. "You'll like it," my mom said softly, but I could tell she was waiting for me to argue, to resist. Still, I said nothing. Tom was gone, and I was supposed to be the one left behind. I glanced back at my phone, the cold screen staring back at me, offering nothing but silence. This wasn't just a trip. It was a break from my life, a shift that I wasn't ready for. The airport seemed like the beginning of something much bigger than I had bargained for, and yet I could feel it looming, as though something in me was already bracing for what was coming next. We arrived late, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the house. My uncle's place, perched on the rocky coastline of California, was everything I had imagined, simple, even modest, yet somehow imposing against the backdrop of the ocean. The scent of wood and salt water mixed in the cool night air, the waves crashing rhythmically below. I dragged my suitcase into the house, feeling an immediate chill despite the warmth inside. The living room was dimly lit, the furniture old but well kept. It felt like stepping into another world, one that was unfamiliar and strange. I had no place here. The room where I was supposed to sleep was small and bare, with only the essentials, a bed, a dresser, and a window that framed the dark expanse of the ocean. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding. Uncle John didn't seem to notice. He was already unpacking his things, his movements quick and assured. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, his tone as relaxed as always. "We'll go for a walk tomorrow. Get some fresh air." I didn't respond, just nodded absent-mindedly. He seemed so at ease with everything, like this was his routine, like it was all so normal for him. It irritated me, that quiet confidence of his. He had no idea who I was or what I was going through. I felt small, lost in the space of his home, with no way of filling the emptiness that hung around me. The house was quiet now, except for the distant sound of waves. I tried to focus on that sound, hoping it would calm me, but it only made me feel more disconnected. I didn't belong here. The thought kept swirling in my mind. I was far from home, away from everything that was familiar. I wanted to be with Tom, not stuck here, alone with a man I barely knew. Yet here I was, dragged into a strange situation with no escape and no way to make sense of it. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy. Sleep didn't come easily. Instead, my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control. What was the point of all this? Why had my mom insisted on this trip? The questions gnawed at me, but there were no answers. Only the relentless sound of the ocean outside. It was like a reminder, nothing would be the same after this. I couldn't help but wonder if, despite all my resistance, I was already beginning to feel something. Something I couldn't name. something that felt unsettling, but oddly compelling. The morning came too quickly, the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the curtains. I woke up to the sound of the ocean again, the rhythmic crash of waves, so different from the silence of the city. It was calming, in a way, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettling, something unfamiliar. I got out of bed and walked to the window, my eyes scanning the view. The cliffs dropped down into the water, jagged rocks jutting out like silent sentinels. The sky was clear, the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It was beautiful in its own way, but it felt so far removed from everything I knew. By the time I had gathered myself, I could hear the sounds of movement in the kitchen. Uncle John was already up, of course. He had probably been awake for hours. I wandered downstairs, my stomach twisting. I hadn't been hungry all night, but the smell of something cooking drifted up to me, and my body betrayed me, demanding food. There he was, standing by the stove, humming softly to himself as he prepared breakfast. It was surreal. He moved with such ease, like he had done this 1,000 times, his movements fluid, confident. The way he worked in the kitchen was strangely mesmerizing. I had never seen anyone cook with such casual authority before. "Morning," he said, glancing over at me with a smile that seemed both genuine and distant at the same time. "Morning," I replied, though I wasn't sure what else to say. I didn't want to be here, but there was something about the way he spoke, the way he moved, that made it hard to feel completely disconnected from the moment. He set a plate of eggs and toast in front of me at the kitchen table, then took a seat across from me. I picked at my food, feeling the silence stretch between us. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was too quiet, too still. "So," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the calm, "we're going for a walk along the beach later. I think you'll like it. It's a good way to clear your mind." I nodded, but I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to go for a walk. I didn't want anything that involved him, but I felt the pressure of his calm gaze on me, waiting for a response. "Sure," I said, my voice quiet. I knew it wasn't sincere, but I couldn't bring myself to protest. What was the point? The walk was his idea, and I found myself giving in. After breakfast, we both headed outside. The air was cool, but the sun was already warming the earth, casting long shadows on the sand. We didn't speak at first, and I was grateful for that. But as we walked along the shoreline, the rhythm of our footsteps in sync with the waves, something shifted. I nearly slipped on a rock, my foot catching on the slick surface. Before I could catch myself, Uncle John's hand was there, steadying me, his touch warm and firm on my waist. It was a brief contact, just a moment, but I felt the heat of his palm through my clothes. I pulled away instinctively, my heart racing in my chest, but he didn't seem to notice. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You okay?" he asked casually, his hand still hovering near me, just a little too close. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The strange feeling in my stomach only deepened, twisting with something I couldn't quite identify. I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't shake the image of his hand on my waist, the warmth of his touch. We continued walking in silence, but the quiet wasn't the same anymore. It had changed. There was something unspoken between us now, a tension I couldn't ignore. By the time we turned back to the house, I could feel it, this shift in the air, this subtle change that neither of us was acknowledging. It was a crack in the calm surface of everything, and I knew deep down that things weren't going to stay simple for long. I just didn't know how much it was going to hurt when they finally broke. Dinner was quieter than usual. Uncle John talked about his travels, his words vivid and alive. His stories were captivating, but it wasn't just his words that held me. It was the way his eyes lingered on me, the way he seemed to see through me. I found myself waiting for the next glance, the next word, even though I didn't want to. When he smiled, it was like the whole room paused. There was something in his gaze, something more than mere interest. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered. After dinner, we stepped outside to the porch. The evening was calm, the ocean's sound filling the air. Uncle John continued his stories, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. I could feel the pull between us. As he reached for his cup, his fingers brushed mine. It wasn't accidental, the touch lasting a fraction longer than necessary. My heart skipped, and I quickly pulled my hand away. "Sorry," he said, but his voice was softer than before. I didn't know how to respond. My thoughts swirled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something neither of us was willing to acknowledge. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. Later that evening, after everything had quieted down, I stepped out onto the balcony, needing space. The ocean roared below, and the moonlight bathed the landscape in a silvery glow. It should have been peaceful, but the tension that had been building all day still gnawed at me. I wasn't sure how long I had been standing there, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Uncle John, holding a cup of tea in his hands. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to me, staring out at the horizon. We didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. The silence was thick but not uncomfortable, just heavy, like the air before a storm. And then, without warning, his hand brushed against my shoulder. It wasn't a sudden gesture, it was deliberate, slow. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I froze, unable to pull away. His fingers lingered there, almost possessive, like he was waiting for me to react. I should have stepped back. I should have pulled away. But instead, I stood still, caught in the warmth of his hand, the pull of his presence. And then, just as quietly, his lips brushed against mine. It was soft, tentative, almost as if he were waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment stretched on, and something inside me cracked. Something I hadn't been willing to admit to myself. I knew it was wrong. I knew it shouldn't have happened, but I didn't stop him. When the kiss finally ended, I pulled away, my breath shallow, my mind racing. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though it didn't sound like an apology. It was something else, something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The world around me felt distant, disconnected. I wasn't sure what had just happened or what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. Everything had just changed. The next morning, everything felt oddly normal, like the kiss had never happened. The air was the same, the ocean sounded the same, and Uncle John acted like nothing had shifted between us. He was as calm as always, as though nothing had changed, and it made me feel even more uneasy. But I couldn't shake the heaviness in the pit of my stomach. Every time he looked at me, his gaze lingered just a moment longer, and when his hand brushed mine, it felt like a silent promise I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew better. We were sitting outside on the porch after breakfast, the sun warm on our skin, and I caught him staring at me again. Not just glancing, but really looking. I wanted to look away, to ignore it, but something inside me was drawn to him. I could feel his presence, like a pull, and my heart began to race despite myself. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the silence. There was an edge to his voice, a hint of something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was concern, maybe it was something else, but it made me uneasy. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, not meeting his eyes, but the words felt hollow. He smiled, but it wasn't the casual smile I'd seen before. There was something heavier about it. He leaned in slightly, just enough for me to feel his warmth. "You don't have to pretend, you know. It's okay to feel confused." I wanted to scream at him, tell him that it was more than confusion, that it was wrong, that I was betraying everything I knew. But all I could do was nod, my throat tight, my mind screaming for clarity, but my body betraying me. I couldn't stop the way my heart beat faster when he was near, couldn't stop the way his presence felt like a magnet pulling me in. I tried to remind myself of Tom, of everything we had. I tried to remember why I was with him, why I couldn't let this, whatever this was, take hold. But the more I tried to fight it, the more it felt like I was sinking into something I couldn't escape. "Maybe you just need time," he said softly. "Time to let yourself feel happy." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me, drowning any resistance I had left. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but there was something about the way he spoke, so sure of himself, so calm, that made me second-guess everything I knew about myself. For a moment, I felt paralyzed. My thoughts were tangled, spinning in circles. The guilt was suffocating, but the desire to feel something, to feel alive, was stronger. I wanted to scream, to run away, to escape the tight knot in my chest, but instead, I stayed there. Silent. My heart racing, my mind torn between what I wanted and what I knew was right. The following day, I tried to avoid him. I told myself I needed space, that it was better to keep my distance, but it didn't help. It only made things worse. Every time I saw him, every time he spoke, I could feel that electric tension between us, that unspoken pull. It was impossible to ignore, like a weight pressing down on me. That afternoon, he suggested we drive to the nearby town to pick up some groceries. I hesitated at first, but something in me agreed. Maybe it was the isolation of the house, the emptiness that seemed to grow every time we were apart. Maybe I just needed to get away from the tension between us. The drive was quiet, the road winding through the hills, the landscape stretching out before us. But the silence between us wasn't comfortable. It was thick with anticipation. Every glance he threw my way, every small movement felt charged. I couldn't escape it, couldn't pretend it wasn't there. We arrived at the store, and as we walked through the aisles, he casually mentioned a bracelet he had seen earlier. "I think you'd look good in it," he said, his tone light but his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my stomach twist. "I don't need it," I said quickly, trying to brush off the sudden wave of discomfort. I didn't want him buying me anything. I didn't want to owe him anything. But he insisted, his voice soft but firm. "It's just a small thing. You deserve something nice." His words, simple as they were, made my chest tighten. I could feel the heat of his hand as he reached for the bracelet, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop the way my body reacted to him, couldn't stop the way I craved his touch, even though I knew it was wrong. That night, after dinner, I found myself unable to hide the tears that had been building up inside me. I retreated to the corner of the living room, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the confusion, it was all too much. Uncle John found me there, standing by the window, my back to him. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there watching me until I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know how to stop this." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space around me. "You don't have to stop it," he said softly, his voice almost soothing. "You're allowed to be happy. You're allowed to feel what you feel." His words were like a balm, soothing the chaos inside me, and for a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that what was happening between us was just natural, that I wasn't betraying everything I had with Tom, that I wasn't destroying my own sense of self. But I knew better. This wasn't right. None of this was. I stepped away from him, my heart racing in my chest. "I can't," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't do this." He didn't move, didn't try to stop me. But I saw it in his eyes, something almost like regret. Something that told me he knew, deep down, that this was wrong too. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done, and there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension that neither of us acknowledged directly, but that hung between us like a shadow. I felt suffocated by it, by the secret, by the unrelenting pull of everything I was trying to deny. Yet every moment spent in the house, every glance he sent my way, reminded me that I wasn't the same anymore. I couldn't go back to who I was before. On the last evening, after everything had settled into a painful, fragile silence, Uncle John and I finally spoke. We sat in the dimly lit living room, the only sound the occasional crack of the fire in the hearth. "I know this is difficult," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. There was a softness to his words, like he was trying to be careful, but I could still feel the weight of everything unspoken. "I'm sorry," I muttered, the words feeling hollow. This was a mistake. I never should have let it go this far. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding or maybe regret. "You don't have to apologize," he said gently. "We can't always control what we feel." But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept that I had let myself be drawn into something I knew was wrong, that I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I thought about Tom, about the life I had left behind, about how my actions had shattered it in ways I didn't know how to fix. The guilt weighed on me, suffocating me, and I couldn't bear to be in this place anymore.